Okay, hello everyone. Let me now welcome you to the third keynote session of ACCS8. And for that, let me introduce to you once again Dr. Shyam, Director of Amrita Mind Brain Center, Amrita Vidyapeetham. Dr. Shyam is the Director of the AMBC and a professor at the School of Engineering, Amrita Vidyapeetham. He is the Institute Integration Coordinator of a national mission project on virtual laboratories and is a PI for a cognitive science project funded by CSRI, Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. At the Amrita Mind Brain Center, his research looks into computational neuroscience, neurophysiology, systems modeling, and developing virtual reality-based tools for education. I invite Dr. Shyam to chair the third keynote session.
A very good afternoon to all of you here as part of our ACCS8. It's a very big honor to be here as a local organizing host to see people from everywhere come on. And this is our very prestigious Keynote 3 being given by our Professor Kenji Doya. Professor Kenji Doya is a professor of Neural Computation Unit, Okinawa, Institute of Science and Technology, OIST, Graduate University. He took his PhD in 1991 at the University of Tokyo and worked as a postdoc in UC San Diego and the Salk Institute. In 1994, he joined the Advanced Telecommunications Research International, ATR, as a senior researcher and then served as its group leader of the Kawato Dynamic Brain Project. In 2004, he was appointed as a principal investigator of the OIST International Research Project and started the Okinawa Computational Neuroscience course, OCNC, as the chief organizer. As OIST established itself as a graduate university in 2011, he became a professor and served as the vice provost for research. He's interested in reinforcement learning in both natural and artificial creatures. He has served as a co-editor in chief of neural networks from 2008 to 2021, and a board member of the INNS, the International Neural Network Society, the JNNS, Japanese Neural Network Society, and Japan Neuroscience Society, JNSS. He serves as a chairperson of the Neuro 2022 conference in Okinawa. He received the INNS Donald O. Hebb Award in 2018, the JNNS Academic Award, the APNNS Outstanding Achievement Award, and the age group second place at Ironman Taiwan in 2019. It's a very big honor to have you, Dr. Kenji-san. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I'd like to thank Shyam and organizers of this conference for giving me this nice opportunity for interacting with students and researchers from a wide variety of fields in cognitive science. Right? Okay, so then let me start to share my screen. So the title of my talk today is Neural Circuits for Mental Simulation. Right. Okay, so I'm from Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology Graduate University, which is a relatively new graduate university built on like a southern island of Japan, and it is aimed to be very international and then interdisciplinary graduate school. Yeah. So do people know where is Okinawa? So Okinawa is in the middle of the ocean, yeah, and it takes a 2.5-hour flight from Tokyo. But actually, so it is closer to many other major cities in Southeast Asia. And we don't have, unfortunately, not direct flight with India yet. But with this location, we want not only the tourists, but also students and researchers to come to Okinawa for cross-disciplinary research. So our university started 10 years ago, but it's still quite a small university with about 80 faculty members. So, but because we are small, if we divide the output by the numbers, so sometimes we have a wide fluctuation. So in the last Nature Index. In one of their score, so our university was listed 9th in the world, slightly above MIT and Stanford, and the top in Japan. And I hope this kind of a trend continues in the next following years. And because our lab was the first unit in this interdisciplinary university, so I tried to make our own lab called the Neural Computation Unit interdisciplinary place. So one topic of our research is creating flexible adaptive agents. Another is revealing the brain's mechanism for learning. So we perform machine learning and robotics experiments, and also neurobiology experiments using rats and mice. Right? But the common topic is reinforcement learning. So probably many of you are already familiar with the concept. So reinforcement learning is a framework for an agent, which can be humans or animals or robots or software, to interact with the environment, and then sending an action depending on the state, and then get the reward feedback, evaluating how good or bad the agent is performing. And then the aim of the learning is to learn action policy, which is a mapping from a state to action to maximize the reward acquired. So in engineering, coming up with a more efficient and robust algorithms for artificial agents is a very important topic. And also for neuroscience, so clarifying the circuit and molecular mechanisms in the brain for reward-oriented learning is also a very important topic. And if you make a progress in one side, probably that will give you some kind of inspiration to the other side. So that's why we try to pursue this engineering approach and then neuroscience approach in parallel. So actually, it was my undergraduate work many years ago. I started to work on the problem. So this was like a mid-1980s when the personal computer became available to undergraduate students. So I tried to make something interesting. So I created a small robot. But rather than for me, especially in the movement, I wanted the robot to learn how to perform some task. For example, just walking in this case. So then how can we let the robots learn? At that time, there's no textbook about the robot learning. So, but I thought maybe you need to do two things. One is to define different behaviors by certain numbers. And another is to evaluate the performance also by certain numbers, right? So to describe the movement, this robot has an open and closed angle of the foreleg and the hind leg. So that gives us 4 parameters. And if you include the speed, the cycle of locomotion, it gives 5 parameters. And then in this 5-dimension parameter space, you want to monitor the performance. For that, this robot pulls this rotary encoder to measure how quickly or slowly it is moving. And then utilizing a very simple hill climb algorithm, I could find that this kind of a creature can find dynamic locomotion pattern which exploit the dynamic feature of the body. So that was the beginning of my research. So at that time, I didn't know the word reinforcement learning, but it was about the same time when the pioneers Andy Bartow and Rich Sutton formulated the modern form of reinforcement learning, which is now called TD learning. Right? So the key component of the modern reinforcement learning is a prediction of the future reward. Right? So this is a kind of a standard feedback control system. So in this paper, they used this cart pole balancing as a task. And then depending on the position, velocity, and the angle and angular velocity of this pole, you want to give a force feedback to this cart to keep the pole upright. So this is a kind of a nonlinear feedback control system. And then this feedback system has a feedback parameters. And the important finding by Bartle and colleagues is that rather than directly associating the performance with the change of the weights, so it is much better if you create so-called a critic that tries to predict the long-term performance of the system, and then using its reward, its prediction error for tuning these weights. So that is the beginning of the modern reinforcement learning. So this is my own example of a pendulum swing up task. So this is a two-dimensional system. The state variable is the angle and angular velocity of the pendulum. And if you have a strong motor, you can swing this pendulum upright. The reward is given by the height of this head of the pendulum. Right? So, and while this movement is going on, the critic learns the goodness of a different combination of the angle and angular velocity. The white part is the relatively good part. Right? So by experience, this agent learned that a certain combination of the angle and angular velocity gives you a decelerating path to the stopping at the top, right? And this kind of evaluation of the goodness of different angle and angular velocity is a guiding signal for learning the right feedback control. After several tens of trials, this agent could swing up and then hold a pendulum at the maximum reward position. Right? So this is how such a prediction of the reward is important for the nonlinear dynamic control. So we have applied the similar framework for physical robots as well. So this is the robot that learns to stand up on its own. So initially, this makes a kind of a trial and error. So we gave the reward according to the height of the head from the floor. Right? Yeah. So, but after many hundreds of bumps and falls, this robot learned this kind of nice sequence to stand up by itself. So one important aspect of this result is that initially the robot keeps the head on the floor. So that means the immediate reward is 0. But by pushing the weight on top of the foot, it can stand up subsequently. So this is a kind of a delayed reward problem. Then the interesting feature of the TD learning is that because of the prediction of the forthcoming reward, the robot can, an agent can learn the task of delayed reward. For example, if you want to maximize the reward from this point, the robot may just sit up, upper body, and then stuck here. So this is initially no reward, but later it can get a much larger reward. So that is an important point of reinforcement learning. Right? And by doing this kind of experiments, we learned a lot of things. For example, the setting of the reward and setting of the parameters are quite important. Right? So for example, in this robot, when the robot fell down, we gave a punishment or negative reward. But the balance between the positive reward and negative reward is very important. If you give too much negative reward, the robot may just end up lying down to avoid any harm. Right? So and that kind of experience motivated us to work on a higher level problem. How agents acquire its own reward and punishment functions. So for doing that, we wanted to set up like higher level goal with the analogy of the living creature. So we imposed like a survival by catching a battery pack and also reproduction. So for robots to reproduce itself is not quite easy. Sorry. Okay, so sorry, this movie seems to be not working. Yeah, but in these robots, they have a, yeah, it started to move, have an infrared communication port. They can copy the program or the parameters of the common program. So it can do reproduction in software. So in this kind of a setup, you can implement a distributed evolutionary framework. We verify that these robots can evolve their own reward functions. Right. And more recently, we are working on the smartphone-based robot. This is a robot, smartphone with a balancer control using the accelerometer on the smartphone. And it can detect the charging station and approach to recharge itself. And for the reproduction, you can use Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, but for us to better understand what's happening, so this robot does show a secret code by QR code and then copy certain parameters. In this case, the policy for feedback control, right? So this is a kind of a new platform we are working on. Okay, so and then to summarize the like a theoretical part, so and reinforcement learning has a three major components. One is the prediction of future reward in the form of so-called value function. So here, V of S is called a state value function. This is the expectation of how much reward you are going to get in the future. So here, gamma is called a temporal discounting parameter, which controls how long into the future you will take into account in evaluation. If gamma equals 0, you just focus on the immediate outcome. So as gamma goes close to 1, you take into account the longer delayed reward. So there's another form of a value function called the action value function. This evaluates how much reward you're going to get by performing a certain action of a certain state. So, for example, this action value function can be used for action selection. So if you completed learning action value function, what you have to do at a given state S is look for an action which gives the maximum expectation of reward. So that is called a greedy action selection. So earlier in learning, you would like to do like stochastic exploration. In that case, you can use like a thermodynamics analogy. So take the action value as a kind of negative potential, and then find an action which makes stochastically larger action value. Here, the beta is called the temporal discount, the inverse temperature parameter. So if the beta is 0, you take all the action with equal probability. As the beta becomes large, any small difference in the action value are amplified. So the policy becomes more greedy. Right. So, and predicting the reward and taking an action, you will learn from the actual experience, which is based on the temporal difference error. So this is a difference between the future reward you predicted before taking action and the reward you got by taking action, and then reward you would further expect from the new state with discounting by gamma. Because of this exponential discounting, if your prediction is perfect, the previous prediction should be equal to the reward you actually get and you are still going to get. And if there's any discrepancy, you have to learn from such a discrepancy. So you will update the state value function of the previous state in proportion to this temporal difference error, or the action value in proportion to this temporal difference error. Here, the alpha is the learning rate to control how much you update your memory from a single experience. So in reinforcement learning, we repeat this prediction, action selection, and the learning from the result. And how to implement these steps more efficiently and robustly is a very important topic in reinforcement learning algorithms. And also important is how to tune these parameters, like temporal discounting or inverse temperature or learning rate. So that is also a very important problem, sometimes called a kind of meta-learning. Right? So, but we think that these are issues of implementing these steps and then tuning these parameters are also an important topic for neuroscience. So our brain may not be utilizing exactly the same equations, but prediction, reward, and action selection and learning for the outcome is something that should be happening in our brain. So then how our brain implements such computation, and also how the parameters of such learning is controlled depending on the situation. I think there is a very important question in neuroscience. So in the domain of engineering and the AI application of reinforced learning, recent progress is the use of deep neural networks for the approximation of the state and action value functions. So this is the epoch-making paper in 2015 by DeepMind people. So they took a computer game and they took the computer screen as the input and the control of the joystick and the button as the output, and then the learned action value function for these different commands depending on the screen input. So before, it has been shown that the combination of the temporal difference learning with the deep neural network can sometimes make unstable learning. But they came up with the idea of storing experience in the buffer and randomly resample the experience for learning, and also preparing two copies of a network, one for the future part, one for the current part, will stabilize the learning process. So then they show that even the same network with the same parameter can learn different computer games. And then this successful combination of TD learning and deep neural network is the source of subsequent success in AlphaGo of beating the human champion in a very difficult game of Go. So the nice thing about this value network made of deep neural network learned by TD learning is that it can evaluate goodness of the border position just by from its image, right? So instead of going searching wide and deep all the possible future games, so this value network allow you to narrow down the better candidates and make a decision without predicting the game at the end of the game, right? So that's how the AlphaGo made this previously said far away goal in achievable in today's computer. So, and even though the human champion was defeated by the computer, there's actually still a lot of things we should learn from human reinforcement learning. And one thing often pointed out is the energy consumption. So behind AlphaGo, there's a huge cluster computer spending a lot of energy. On the other hand, the energy consumption of the human brain is supposed to be around just 20 watt. So how we can make such energy efficient operation and also a data efficient operation, and that is a big question. So the reason for the strength of the computer program is that they can sample huge data by simulating millions of games, which any human cannot experience in the lifetime. Right? So then regarding the brain's implementation of reinforcement learning, many people, including ourselves, consider that the basal ganglia, which is a hidden brain structure under the cerebral cortex, play a very important role. Right? So, and the one important feature of the basal ganglia is that its input site called striatum receives a stronger dopaminergic input from the substantia nigra. So, the very epoch-making finding was by the Wolfram Schultz was that dopamine neurons respond to reward prediction error, similar to the temporal difference error. Right? So when the reward is predicted without any cue, so dopamine neurons respond to the reward itself. Right? And when the some cue, like a visual stimulus, is presented before the reward. So the dopamine neuron respond to this reward predicted cue, and then do not respond to the reward itself. And when the reward is sometimes omitted, the dopamine neuron is suppressed. So this is an interesting observation in itself, but this was quite exciting for those of us who were familiar with reinforcement learning theory, because this is exactly what we expect for a temporal difference error to behave. So before learning, so this B should be 0, so then you have a delta equal R. So the dopamine TD error is equal as the reward signal. So after learning, so as the cue is presented, so that allows the reward prediction. So the value function should go up, and this temporal differentiation gives you a positive response. And at the time of reward, so reward itself is positive, but reward prediction comes down to the baseline. So this gives a negative component by temporal differentiation. So they cancel out with no output. And when the reward is predicted but not acquired, so this will cause a negative response. So motivated by this finding, so many people started to propose the model of basal ganglia in reinforcement learning. So this is our version. So our specific hypothesis was that in this input site of the basal ganglia called striatum, because it receives a dopaminergic input, and also it has been shown by our colleague Jeff Wickens that the synapse linking the cortex to the striatum has a so-called dopamine-dependent plasticity mechanism. So maybe then the striatum would be the ideal place for learning key variables like action value function or state value function. And then to test such a hypothesis, we performed rat experiments. So in this experiment, rat first poke his nose to the center hole, and depending on the sound, he chooses either left or right hole. And then, depending on his choice, he gets a food pellet. And we changed the reward probability time to time, so the rat keeps learning the reward probability for the left choice and right choice. And then we fitted the animal's choice sequence to reinforcement learning model and estimated the action value function over the trials. this is like this. And then we use this as a kind of a fingerprint for detecting interesting neurons in the recorded signals. And for example, this neuron changed its activity during the Q tone like this, highly correlated with the action value function for the left. Some other neurons had the action value function, the high correlation with the action value from the right, and some others had a correlation with the both, like a state value function. So this experiment showed that there are indeed action value or state value like neurons in the striatum. And one limitation using conventional electro recording, that we could not dissociate different types of neurons. But more recently, using calcium imaging, using molecular markers for different neurons, so we could show that these particular type of neurons projecting to the dopaminergic neuron show the state value function like response. When the cue is presented, its activities go up. Right? So, and using electrode and the recent optical recording and manipulation method, the neural mechanism of the brain in reinforcement learning has been gradually well understood. But the reinforcement learning framework I have explained so far is so-called model-free framework. So we assume no knowledge of the agent about the world, and then agents just learn from the sequence of experience of state, action, and the reward. And then the action can be found, for example, by the softmax function of the action value, very simply. So, but this kind of a framework takes a lot of trial for learning. Another framework in the reinforcement learning is called model-based strategy. So in this case, the agent tries to learn the prediction model of how the state changes with the action taken. So using such an internal model, so agent can run a simulation before actually taking physical action. So, and it can be helpful for either estimating the current state from the previous action, or planning ahead the good action to reach to the high reward states. So this is kind of a deliberate and then take an action. Right? So this allows a more flexible adaptation, but it can take a heavy computational load. So how to decide between or mix the model-free and model-based strategy is a very important problem in engineering design. So, for example, this is the example of a model-based reinforcement learning called Pilco. So this robot has the highest reward when it's kept upright. And initially, during this random movement, the robot takes data and build a model of how the body responds to the wheel movement. And then by simulation, it seeks the right action policy. And then within less than 10 trials, this robot could learn the policy of bouncing up and balance. So this is one example of how the model-based approach can be very data efficient. So in addition to the robots, so such a model-based strategy is something humans and possibly animals would be taken. So we term such a process kind of mental simulation, brain's processing using an action-dependent state transition model. S prime equal f of SA is a kind of deterministic case. In a more general, it's an action-dependent state transition probability. Right? So if you have such a dynamic model, you can use it for estimating the present state based on the past state and action. That can be very helpful when the immediate sensory feedback is noisy or delayed or occluded. And you can utilize such a model for planning ahead what's the right action or action sequence to reach to the high reward state. And you can apply such a model for arbitrary state for imagination or thought experiments, right? So such a thinking would be very important for the cognitive behavior, and also use of language is dependent on our capability for imagination based on the word cue. And also when you establish a scientific theory, you initially have to run lots of thought experiments. So this mental simulation is a very important component of human intelligent behaviors, starting from sensory motor control to more cognitive behaviors, right? And then understanding the mechanism for mental simulation, I think, is a very important topic of neuroscience today, right? How our brain acquires such a model, how we control such a simulation. So this is not still understand, but very important topic. So one clue regarding the implementation of mental simulation is the different computational roles of different parts of the brain. So this is my quite old framework, but major parts of the brain, cerebellum, the basal ganglia, and the cerebral cortex, appear to be specialized in different forms of learning. The learning in the cerebellum is guided by the target and the error signal conveyed by the climbing fiber from the inferior olive. So such a supervised learning would be helpful for acquiring a deterministic prediction model. Right? And the basal ganglia learning is based on the reward prediction error signal by the dopamine neurons. As I already said, the basal ganglia would play a very important role in reinforcement learning. And the cerebral cortex may not have a specific teaching signal, but it has been shown that the cerebral cortex has like unsupervised learning capability to finding the important features in the sensory motor signal. Right? So how can we combine those functions, those components for mental simulation? So for example, simple model-free action selection can be implemented by linking the action value function in the basal ganglia with the state and action representation learned in the cortex. Right? And for the model-based strategy, it is a little bit complex, but you can think about this kind of a scheme. For current state, some part of the brain come up with a kind of action candidate, and then it is put into the forward model and predict the forthcoming state. And then the state value function of the basal ganglia evaluate the goodness of the state. And if it's good enough, you execute the action, and otherwise you come up with another candidate. So this is a rather complicated process, but once you learn that this is a good action to take for a given state. So rather than repeating this computation again and again, you just want to memorize this state action mapping. That is another topic of supervised learning. So some other part of the cerebellum may learn the appropriate state action mapping based on the previous experience. And then to test such hypothesis, we design a functional MRI experiment. So this is a computer game of moving this cursor from the starting point to the goal state. And to make this game interesting, we limited the movement of the cursor to 3 out of 8 neighbors for the pressing of the one of the 3 buttons. So for certain direction, there's no direct path. You have to find this kind of zigzag movement, which is rather difficult to find by just a random trial and error. But once you have in this kind of action-dependent state transition model, you can fairly efficiently find this kind of path. Right? And we train the subjects with this key map or action-dependent state transition model, and then show the new target and let the subject plan ahead for the right sequence. So, and from the behavior, we could verify that this action planning was indeed helpful for the higher performance. And then we analyzed the brain activity during the pre-start delay period, when subjects did not move the fingers, but used the internal simulation to seek the right path. During that time, we found the high activities in the parietal cortex and the premotor cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And in addition, the part of the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, which are connected to these parts. Right? So this suggests that the mental simulation involves not only the cortical, but also cerebellar and the basal ganglia network. So our interpretation, according to our theoretical framework, is that the cerebellum would be used for the prediction of the future state using a kind of a pre-learned state transition model. And also the basal ganglia is utilizing the evaluating the predicted state, whether it's good enough for execution. So to further clarify that, we are hoping to do some kind of a decoding experiment to clarify the differential role of these different parts of the brain. Okay, so we are also interested in what kind of a mechanism is going on in the cortical circuit in the mental simulation. So for doing that, we took the animal experiment in collaboration with optical imaging expert, my colleague at Oyster, Professor Bernd Kuhn, and our shared postdoc, Aki Funamizu. So this is a so-called two-photon microscope, which uses infrared light to monitor the activity of the neurons up to 0.5 millimeter under the cortical surface. So we do a surgery to put the cover glass under the cortical surface and also use a virus to express the calcium indicator in the excitatory neurons in the cerebral cortex. So this is a kind of a virtual environment. As the mouse walks on this air-floated ball, depending on the ball's movement, we change the sound feedback. So initially small sound in the front, gradually large sound by the side. This kind of simulates the mouse's approach to this goal line where he is given a sugar water reward. And then to address the mechanism of state estimation, so in some trials, we created a no sound zone, like this white segment in the path. So this is similar to our popular beach game, like watermelon squashing. So you do not see the target, but based on how many steps you have taken, and also the sporadic sound from around, you can estimate the target location and get the reward. So this is the actual mouse behavior. We changed the initial distance to the target, and the result is sorted by the initial distance. So this black dot is like a predictive licking of the sugar water pond. You can see as the mouse goes close to the target, it increases the licking. So it was not just randomly. So he estimated how close he came to the target. And the anticipated licking increased almost exponentially. And importantly, even if we omitted the sound feedback, this licking increased, meaning that the mouse could estimate goal distance even without any sensory feedback using the how many steps he has made since the last time. And when we injected the drug to suppress the activity of the parietal cortex, such an increase disappeared, showing that the posterior parietal cortex has an important role in estimating the current state based on the action. And while Amrita is working on this behavior, we could monitor hundreds of neurons in the parietal cortex from a layer 2 down to a layer 5. So this is a kind of summary of thousands of neurons which Akihiro recorded for his PhD. And some of the neurons have a specific distance tuning to the target. Some of them have a ramping activities. Some of them have activity after reward consumption. Right? And then based on such a population activity, we can construct a decoder. So each neuron have a different distance tuning to the target. And based on this distance tuning, so from the instantaneous population neural activity, we can estimate the posterior probability of the goal distance based on the Bayesian framework. And this result shows that even during the no sound zone, the posterior probability goes closer to the target. So this suggests that the neural representation of estimated current state is represented in the network of the parietal cortex. And when the sound feedback is turned on again, so the variance was reduced. So this is became much sharper. So this is something quite similar to what you expect for dynamic Bayesian inference, such as Kalman filtering. So when the sound sensory cue is not available, use the internal model to make an estimate. And when the sensory feedback is available, that is used for reduced uncertainty in your the estimate. Right? So we are hoping to further understand the neural circuit mechanism of such a dynamic Bayesian inference. Right. So and then the how this kind of inference is done in the actual cortical circuit. So there has been several hypotheses about how Bayesian inference is implemented in the circuit of the cortex, for example, by the Rajesh Rao or Carl Friston and many other people. And recently, the so-called duality between the Bayesian inference and control has a modern look. So the people like Sergey Levin provided a framework to make a kind of one-to-one correspondence with the computational components for the Bayesian inference and the components in the reinforcement learning. So that kind of a correspondence would allow us to create a model of the brain, the sensory cortex and motor cortex simultaneously. So we are hoping to design an experiment to test this kind of hypothesis. Okay, so and finally, I want to talk a bit about this parameter tuning. So this temporal discounting factor is a very interesting parameter. So this robot finds the battery pack and then gradually learn to go straight ahead. And this robot can see the battery pack, but somehow it doesn't want to move toward that unless the battery pack is seen very, very close, very, very close. Right. So we are wondering why this robot is such like a depressed state. So, but the mechanism like this, when the gamma is very close to 0, gamma squared, the gamma cube converges very quickly to 0. So there's almost no way to the delayed positive reward. So if it incurs some cost, the entire evaluation can be negative. So it's not worth performing. So that can result in like depression-like behavior. But when some action is associated with a big negative outcome, so with a small setting gamma, you cannot resist this temptation. Yeah, maybe like a drug or overspending. Yeah. So it can cause impulsive behavior. So this temporal discounting parameter is an interesting parameter to affect the character of a learned behavior. So and controlling the temporal discount parameter is a very important thing in tuning of reinforcement learning algorithms. So gamma has to be large enough for successful behavior. But if you make gamma too large, you try to predict the long future, so which makes learning more challenging. So gamma has to be large enough, but not too large, right? And then how our brain is setting the right time frame for learning. So based on several previous work, we came up with a hypothesis that the brain's serotonergic system would be involved in setting the temporal discounting factor. So one reason for that was that drugs used for the therapy of depression has the function of enhancing serotonin transmission. Maybe that can bring this kind of state back to this healthy state. So in addition to the serotonin, we came up with a hypothesis that the different neuromodulators, which is sent from the brainstem to the wide part of the brain, may control different global parameter or hyperparameter of reinforcement learning, like learning rate, inverse temperature, or temporal discounting. And we have worked on this problem using many different methods, but recently we can use a method called optogenetics, which allow us to suppress or activate certain type of neurons. This mouse has a ion channel expressed in serotonin neurons, which is activated by blue light. And what we found was that by shining a blue light, this mouse makes a less error, less abandoning in waiting for the delayed reward. Sometimes we give a reward omission trial with infinity waiting. So usually mouse abandon after 10 seconds, but with the blue light stimulation of serotonin neurons, it can wait much longer, like 15 seconds or longer. Right? So the serotonin stimulation makes the mouse more patient for the future reward. But we further found that the effect of serotonin stimulation is dependent on the probability. So when the reward probability is 75%, serotonin stimulation has a good effect, but the reward probability is at 25%, the serotonin stimulation doesn't take effect. And also the effect of serotonin stimulation larger when the uncertainty is larger in terms of reward timing. And then to explain such behavior, we came up with a Bayesian decision-making model. So a mouse has an internal model of when the reward pellet comes out, and the longer it waits and for the pellet doesn't come, the likelihood for the rewarding event comes down. And then when it becomes low enough, it abandons. But that is dependent on the prior belief about the reward probability. And then with this model, we could verify that by assuming that serotonin increases the prior probability of reward, we could reproduce the mouse behavior depending on the serotonin stimulation. Right. So, and then given this observation, we extended our model of serotonin, not just the temporal discounting parameter, but in general, utilize the available time and resources for more appropriate behavior. For example, affecting the prior belief about the possibility of success, or the choice between the model-free and model-based behaviors. So we are now going ahead to test such a hypothesis. All right. Okay, so let me conclude. We are starting to understand the mechanism of reinforcement learning in the brain, and also the understanding the model-based reinforcement learning or mental simulation is a very important topic in neuroscience. And by utilizing recent methods in neuron recording and manipulation, that is a feasible, important topic. And probably this mechanism of mental simulation is what we call the consciousness, right? But to do the neuroscience of consciousness, you have to argue about what is consciousness. And then we define mental simulation as a brain process using action-dependent state transition model. So we can more precisely prove its usage and analyze its neural correlate. So that's what we are doing right now. Okay, so let me thank my collaborators who allow us to carry out this kind of exciting work. And finally, I would like to announce that we are going to hold the joint conference of the Neural Network, Neurochemistry, and Neuroscience Societies of Japan. The conference is held in English language, and it is hosted in the Seaside Conference Facility in Okinawa. So then the hope that the current COVID situation will settle down by the summer, and hope many of you decide to come to Okinawa. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kenji. It was a very impressive and very inspiring talk. You moved from robotics to simulations to modeling to neuroscience and way back into training models and simulations again. And we have a few questions. Will it be okay? Shall I?
Yes, of course.
So these are questions from the panel. So they texted me. So the first question is from Moon Mujumdar. She says, is the entire cerebellum involved in action planning, or did you find more focused activity in some specific regions?
Yeah, so actually as I showed, so the activities were rather focused. So this is a kind of a so-called lateral cerebellum, which is known to be connected to the frontal, like a prefrontal cortex. For example, more middle part of the cerebellum has output toward the spinal cord. So this part of the cerebellum, which is connected to the higher cortical site, were specifically activated in this experiment. And also this anterior part of the basal ganglia is also known to be connected with the prefrontal cortex.
Thank you. There's another question from Professor Bapi Raju, the conference chair. He asked, what do you think the role of hippocampus in mental simulations? And he continues saying, do you think sensory state sequences and their memory could involve parietal hippocampal connections?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think we focused on the parietal cortex, but probably this is not the only area involved in mental simulation. So as suggested, hippocampus also play an important role. So for example, in navigation, so hippocampus is known to provide like allocentric place representation. And also, but the parietal cortex appear to have like egocentric spatial representation. So they should be kind of related, and actually the neural connection between the parietal cortex and the hippocampus area, right? So, but because in our two-photon imaging, so accessing the hippocampus was fairly difficult. So we decided to analyze the parietal cortex, which is in the top of the brain like this. So fairly easy to access by this two-photon Yeah, so yeah, it's very interesting how this hippocampus system and parietal system interact in the mental simulation.
We have one more question. What are the roles of other limbic system components such as amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex in reward-based learning?
Okay, yeah. So I focused on the only the cortex and basal ganglia cerebellum, but basal ganglia probably is not the only site for reinforcement learning. So even very simple animals like flies or slugs even have a mechanism of reinforcement learning, right? So another important structure regarding reinforcement learning is the amygdala. So amygdala have different subcomponents. And recent developmental studies suggest that lateral amygdala has a cellular origin similar to the cerebral cortex. And the central amygdala has a cellular origin similar to the basal ganglia. So I take the amygdala as a kind of a miniature cortical basal ganglia circuit, or like a prototype cortical basal ganglia circuit, because this is a evolutionary older structure, right? So and then amygdala in itself can do reinforcement learning, but probably somewhat different in terms of parameter and architecture. So probably the cortical basal ganglia circuit would be tuned better for longer delayed reward prediction, where the amygdala is involved in like immediate reward and punishment prediction. And also the cortical basal ganglia circuit based on the prediction model by the cerebellum and also the working memory function of the cortex, it may be used for a model-based planning and learning, right? So yeah, so cortical basal ganglia circuit and amygdala may share the similar features, but somewhat more sophisticated in the cortical basal ganglia circuit, I think. Yeah.
Somebody adds, Professor Doya, should we stop or can I go for 2 more questions from the audience?
Yeah, so we can go on. Yeah.
Okay, so Tushar Ghosh asks a question about a similar question about what do you think is the role of vestibular nucleus in reward-based learning?
Mm-hmm. So vestibular nucleus is like output nucleus of the cerebellum. Yeah. So recently, several people found out that the cerebellum may also be involved in the reward prediction. So the basal ganglia cerebellum are not as separate as we used to think, and that is, I think, very interesting. So the supervised learning can, in general, be used for predicting vector valued output, but it can also be used for predicting scalar valued output. So some part of the reinforcement learning may be delegated to the cerebral circuit for more like a robust computation. So yeah, so it may be that among the large cerebellum circuit, so some part of them may also be specialized for the mapping from the sensory or motor variable to the predictive reward. Right.
There's a question, thank you, Professor Doya. There's a question from Aisha Noreen. She asks, we've seen you demonstrate the models for reward functions. Will your punishment be a negative reward? Is that the kind of model?
Yeah, so in the simple reinforcement learning paradigm, reward can be positive and negative. But probably in the human and animal brain, there are like a parallel pathways specialized for dealing with a positive reward and negative reward. Right? So, for example, amygdala is often found to be associated with aversive processing, although amygdala is also involved in reward processing. And compared to the basal ganglia, the amygdala seems to take a more like aversive component. And also, even within the basal ganglia, we have different neuron subtypes. And it has been shown that neurons in the ventral part of the striatum, which express the so-called dopamine D2 type receptor, are involved in the learning from a negative result. Right? So, yeah, probably the parallel pathways exist, and then rather than learning the single scalar reward, learning a reward in different domains, positive and negative, separately, and combine them depending on the particular needs. For example, you are in a very urgent situation, or you are in a more relaxed situation. So different weights for different rewards may be possible. So in a real life, reward in the brain may not be just a scalar, but may have some multiple components.
It's a bit late already, but this would be the last question. This is from Dr. Pragati Priyadarshini from IIT Kanpur. She says, do you have any thoughts on the relationship of serotonin functionality on short and long time scales, etc., for risk and phenomena? And will there be, considering that, will there be a unified framework that you will be bringing together in the future?
Yeah, so that is something we try to present in this recent review paper. So serotonin is involved in development and also the different feature of decision and learning. So, but our view is that like a common denominator for such control is how much time or resources you have. So you can spend more time for decision, time for learning. You will take a more sophisticated exploratory behavior. But if you have less time, you have to come up with a quick solution, right? So that will affect not only temporal discounting, but the other parameters like learning rate or exploration or choice of different decision strategies. Right? So this framework again has to be tested, but we are hoping to further test this concept regarding different aspects of serotonin functions.
So that is that brings us to the conclusion of question Q&A to you, Dr. Kenji. We are very, very grateful to thank you for your presence. I know you come from a class and you've been consistently talking, and your talk is very inspiring. Thank you very much for making time for us. And I hope this is just a beginning. And like you said, probably many of us would like to apply to Neuro 22 and hopefully to see you there as well.
Yeah, okay, all right. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shyam, for chairing the session. And thank you, Dr. Kenji, for telling us more about reinforcement learning, about the concept of learning from reward and punishment, and about various designing strategies like model-free and model-based. It was a very exciting talk, sir. And we hope these studies make huge breakthroughs in future. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.